I'm Lori Perine. I'm with the Advanced Information Collaboratory at the University of Maryland. I'm also an assistant professor in the Mathematics, Stats, and Data Science Department at Montgomery College. And I'm going to talk about a project that we've done out of the University of Maryland, where we're using data visualization to improve access to hidden knowledge in archives. So I'll give a little bit of background about this project. It is an extension of some prior work. I'll talk about how the project relates to data viz processes, and then how we applied that to archival collections, and then give a summary of our takeaways from the process. A question to start out with is, why would we even want to visualize archival records? And for the most part, data viz has been used generally as a means to access or search for retrieval within archival records. One of the things that I saw was that it may be possible for us to actually create new understanding of some of the stories that might be embedded in collections, approaching them in a different way, providing a different lens. And in particular, because I and my colleagues had done some prior work with collections related to enslaved people in the state of Maryland, what we recognized is that many of those people were nameless, and had, in some respects, even though they were the central objects of many of the records, the individuals themselves were pretty anonymous and had been erased. So could we begin to tell stories about some of the people who are in historical records who aren't necessarily named, people and communities? So this is an extension of some prior work that we did with these collections. These are collections out of the Maryland State Archives. They're called the Legacy of Slavery collections. And what we did was we used various computational methods to actually do data analysis, to look at what we had in those collections, and to develop new ways to explore information in primarily text-based methods. One of the things that we did in that work is that we did some visualization with respect to just basic data analysis, how many records, what types of information we found. And what we wanted to do was to extend that to interactive types of visualizations. What could we do with that? And so this particular project responds to that desire to move into an interactive area. When I set up this project, I had three key objectives with respect to the design. The first, of course, was to ensure representation of those anonymous people who were in the records. I wanted to see if we could provide an interface that enabled easy engagement with the collection itself. And we wanted to explore to what extent could we actually develop new knowledge on the basis of this interaction with the archival collection. So the approach that I took was to take a basic workflow, and this is a very generic workflow that's used very commonly in data viz, and apply that to our collection. The places of real challenge were basically at the beginning of that workflow, because we were dealing with primarily textual historical documents that were non-standardized in nature. The key documents that we were looking at, digitized documents, were things that were called manumissions records. And manumissions records are those documents that pertained to freeing an individual. And there weren't forms to be filled out at that time, and you didn't necessarily go to a particular place to write down that you were freeing an individual. You did that in your will. Or you did it in a land record, or you did it in a letter. So there are many types of documents that go into the making of a collection with respect to manumissions. There was also a sibling collection called Certificate of Freedoms that documented individuals who had been manumitted. And so one of the things we wanted to try to do was to see if we could actually span both of those collections in terms of the visualization. So those documents had been through a process of digitization, which is primarily that blue section there. So prior to us even looking at the collection, volunteers had come in and taken all of those diverse documents and transcribed them and put that information into a database. That data that had been transcribed is what we took then out of the database, cleaned it up so that we could actually apply computational methods to it. The focus in terms of the computational methods that we use, by the way, and I just want to highlight that part of what we're doing is looking at, are there ways where information professionals, archivists, educators can be doing this type of activity? So you don't have to be a coder. So we're actually looking at what are open source tools that are available to implement these types of activities. So cleaning the data was its own challenge, getting it into a form that could be used with various tools. But an even greater challenge is this idea of encoding attributes so that we could do the data viz. And so those of you who are familiar with data visualization in any way know that it keys off of this idea of marks and channels. That we use different marks, points, lines, areas, geometric marks, figures, shapes, that we use those to represent various attributes in our data, in our information, and then we express different elements or different states of those attributes through these things called channels. So there are things that we're familiar with, like color or the position or the size of things. And if you think about all the things that you've seen visualized, you realize how much is communicated by just small changes and those sorts of things. Now, before I continue, I'm going to tell you that my husband is an artist and I most definitely am not. So, handling all of these things, I feel like I've been your test case in terms of, can a person who has no artistic ability actually implement these sorts of things? The answer is yes, we can. So the super challenge is, what did we have in our data that is encodable in the sense of data viz, that we could change into marks and that we could use channels for? Because it's very text heavy, non-standardized. We want it to represent human beings who are not necessarily identified. And we want to do this in a way that engages and communicates. Then, of course, there's always the ideal in terms of what we'd love to do and versus the technical capability in terms of what the open source software allows us to do, but also in terms of what the person implementing is able to do or capable of doing. So one of the things we did was, one of the things that I did was take a look at what were some of the key descriptive analytical attributes that we had within this data. In both cases, we had certain things that represented time, year being that key element. We had some geographic attributes. For the most part, a lot of the geographic markers had to do with counties in the state. So counties became a very important element ultimately of the visualization. And we also had different elements with respect to the people themselves. In particular, both of these sets of documents contained information with respect to age and gender. To what extent they were accurate, I think questions can be raised, but there were things that we could key off of. And so those elements basically became our encodable attributes because we could identify them as temporal, categorical, or qualitative, and quantitative types of variables, the things that lend themselves to encoding. And so the question then was, how could we encode those via marks and channels in order not only to communicate, but to allow there to be exploration of potential questions to be answered. So I embarked on a conceptual design to create a beta version of what this visualization might look like. And as is common in visualization, what I did was do a little bit of research of how different people, different implementations use those marks and channels to communicate information. And so there were three main influences. The first was, as I mentioned, county was very much a key indicator in the data that we had. So how might we communicate with respect to that geographic element? So we had information by county in different ways. Could we, by virtue of having interactive plots, show time sequences with respect to those counties, distinguish those counties? How dynamic could we make it? And as we're seeing those lines develop, can we get accurate information? Can we use things like these tip point mechanisms? If I'm clicking on something in a web base or if I'm touching something on a screen, can I get accurate information about what's being represented by those lines? A second inspiration happened to be, I happened to look at something where it was showing the changing ranks in information dynamically over time. I thought, wow, that would be kind of cool to do with respect to the number of manumissions documents coming out of the different counties over time. Now, how was that changing over time? That gives a totally new look at how the shifts in terms of the population and what was happening to the people in the population over time. And then finally, very somewhat traditional age and gender types of pyramids. How might we once again use the interactive features and look at things that are dynamic to change? So this became the beta instantiation based on those design concepts. And we put that beta instantiation through a user evaluation. Now, once again, this is a case study, so I did not go out and query, do a full user evaluation with many people. But as happens when you're in a university setting, you grab a few graduate students, some of whom had no clue what they were looking at, and some of whom might have known a little bit about data viz or might have known a little bit about the data sets. And what I did with them is I asked them informational questions about the population or the situation. Basic things like, in what year were the most manumissions recorded in the state of Maryland, right? How do things change with respect to this county and this county over time? So specific information where they would have to actually explore. They'd actually have to explore in order to find out the information. And then I had them rate their experience in terms of ease of use and whether what they got out of the visualization was useful to them. And so overall, they did find it useful. They liked the layout. They liked the way that things were positioned, but we ran into problems with the color palette in ways that I hadn't necessarily, as a person who's not colorblind, hadn't realized to what extent that would limit the utilization. I found that the position of some of the various elements in the visualization incentivized interactivity or not. That people overlooked some of the dynamic elements because of the position of those elements there. And it wasn't always obvious when people could use some of those more fine detail tools, like the tooltips that could give them information. So on that basis, I modified into a final design that looks like this. And so if you are doing, I'm sorry, if you actually take a look at the paper on the website for our workshop, you'll find a link to this so that you can go and actually play with it yourself. What you'll notice is that this looks very different from that beta. And that is because of the feedback that we got from the evaluation. And just very, very quickly, just highlighting that now in this, what you see is that the element related to the people themselves is more prominent in the visualization, and it's linked dynamically through all of the others. So if we go through the years, so this is a dynamic visualization of age and sex over the years, you can click on that, or you can actually manually change it. That will also activate changes in the overall trends and the annual county rankings and so on and so forth. So all of those elements are tied together. Time and place is represented by that trend map, also broken down by counties. That geographic focus with the ranking you see up in the upper corner, and then the bigger picture, which kind of summarizes everything. One of the things that you see that I'm clicking through just for time, but related to this, each one of these gives us a chance to actually look for or to unearth information that we did not necessarily have prior to going into using this visualization about the populations, about the timing of certain activities, and about the places as well. So our big takeaways from this, the dynamic and interactive elements were really, really key in terms of telling a story about those people who were otherwise hidden within the documents, but it also told a broader story about what was happening in society at that time, put a different lens, a better view on just sort of the historical events at the time. Position was really, really important. So position as a channel was not something I necessarily thought was something that I needed to look at, but after trying to implement the design, after having the user feedback, I found that it was actually one of the key essential elements. Having variety supported that engagement and supported the investigation by the reviewers. And you'll notice that there were only 4 elements that were encoded in this information, but represented in different ways, allowed different ways of engagement and of learning, essentially. The static elements that we ended up including in the background provided some context. Color palette is of course important. And so just like with models, you want to have somewhat sparseness, not too sparse, but you don't want things to be too overwhelming so that you engage that high interactivity as well.